Good morning, everyone. Today we will do Parshas Acharei and Kedoshim. We have again a double header, and the theme of Acharei Kedoshim relates to sanctity within boundaries. In other words, sometimes we have a problem with people trying to achieve spiritual highs, and they ignore the fact that we are in a physical world, that you have to be mindful of the fact that the Almighty wants us to live in this physical world, appreciate what exists, utilize it correctly within its boundaries. Don't try to enter into a realm where you do not belong. And if you want to find an example of individuals that went beyond their realm due to some kind of spiritual elevation they felt, you turn to the children of Aharon. And so the portion begins with that warning, Acharei Mot, that listen, you do things wrong. Aharon lost his children because they tried to, as if, exit this world. Now, there is a specific individual that has the right to leave the physical world for the sake of inspiring us who are in this world. We get inspired by people, right, who are, we could call them supernatural. And I don't mean supernatural that they perform miracles. But people who are so committed to the concepts of Judaism, to the teachings of Judaism, to the study of Torah of Judaism, they're not really physical fully. In other words, you take people like great rabbis who had the ability of studying 18 hours a day, and they commit themselves to the study because they realize that this will keep the Jewish people alive not just today, but in 500 years from now. It's a supernatural commitment. But their commitment is there to inspire everyone else, right, to value Judaism as they are involved in the world. God doesn't want all of us to be doing that. He wants people to actually work in the field. He wants people to produce. There's a mitzvah of going to work. It's in Shulchan Aruch, right? We learned in Pirkei Avot that a person is supposed to be in the workplace and still be mindful of the spiritual reality. So we have individuals who are in that supernatural realm, not that everyone should be like them, but to inspire everyone else to understand why they are doing things, right? Being inspired quite often does not mean to change our life, but rather being inspired means to recognize what we are doing and understand that there's a purpose in it, right? We could be doing the exact same thing, but we suddenly look at it very, very differently. You could go outside, and you could see a sunny day, and you could see trees finally awakening, right? That they're coming to life. It's May, right? And in Toronto, that's when, right, what they call down south March. It's a time that the nature comes to life. So you could look at it as just another day, or you could develop an appreciation and see the hand of God and be inspired about the concept of awakening. So we have one individual who actually leaves the physical realm on a day when all of us, in some ways, are supposed to leave the physical realm. And that is, of course, Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a day when we consider it the holiest day of the year. So you could have someone who will claim, now wait a second, Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year. On Yom Kippur, we don't eat. So 1 + 1 = 2. So obviously, if I'm supposed to be holy, so I shouldn't be eating throughout the year, right? That's what I should be learning from the Parsha. Obviously, that is a corrupt reading of what the tradition wants us to do. The tradition wants us to be inspired on that day to figure out how to live the rest of the year. And Aharon HaKohen actually enters into a realm that is supernatural, the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies. You never should be entering there. It is beyond the physical world we live in, the physical world we should be interacting with. Once a year you could. And that's why the children of Aharon, their mistake, right? Their mistake is a significant one. You want to go ahead and enter into that realm, let me tell you how you do it. And that's the beginning of Parashat Acharei Mot. We're going to focus not on that portion, but on page 644. And that has to do with page 644, chapter 17. Now, the rest of the portion deals with many mitzvot, sanctification, a lot of warnings that relate to prohibited marriages and sexual relationships, and that is basically that idea of utilizing the world appropriately. God wants us to procreate, He wants us to live as humans do, but follow the guidelines of Torah. But chapter 17 is what we are going to be focusing on. And we're going to be addressing here a very significant issue, one that the Torah warns us not to be tempted, right? And that is that if you are holding a glass and there's a red substance in it to drink, be sure it is V8 and not blood. That's basically what we're going to be reading. The Torah prohibits us from drinking blood. And the warnings and the fact that these warnings are repeated indicate that there was some kind of strong drive that relates to blood. And we are going to have some difficulty comprehending why are we being given all these warnings. Is it such a temptation? When have any of you been really tempted, right, to go ahead and consume blood, collect blood? It's difficult to understand, but that's where we're going to go ahead on page 644. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. Daber el Aharon vel banav vel kol bnei Yisrael v'amarta alehem. So you are going to speak to them and warn them. Verse 3 on page 646, that when you ever have a person, any man from the house of Israel, who will slaughter a bull, a sheep, a goat in the camp, or outside of the camp, so if he did not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, it is considered a sin that will cause him to be nichrat ha'ish at the end of verse 4. He will be cut off from his people. Now, basically, the way Nachmanides explains the verse, throughout the years in the wilderness, every single time someone had a desire for a fleishik meal, they were to slaughter their animal, but it couldn't be done within their camp. It had to be done by the entrance of the tabernacle. Why? Every single time you wanted a steak, you wanted fleishiks, during the years in the wilderness, they had to go ahead and bring that animal and in some ways offer a portion of it, and then they could walk away and eat the rest. Why? Verse 5. Le'ma'an asher yaviu bnei Yisrael et zivcheim asher hem zovchim al pnei hasadeh vehevium laHashem el petach ol moed al hakohen. So the purpose is that the children of Israel should bring these offerings. He translates here as feast offerings, but Nachmanides means any offerings. And they should be brought to the tabernacle. And what will be done? What is the important service that we are trying to achieve here? Verse 6. V'zarak hakohen et hadam al mizbach Hashem. The blood, and this is the key here, that the Kohen shall throw the blood upon the altar of Hashem. God doesn't want people slaughtering throughout the camp where they could collect the blood, use the blood, but rather the blood should be brought and sprinkled upon the altar. And all that is done. Verse 7. V'lo yizbechu. This is really to prevent them, that they shall no longer slaughter their offerings to the Seirim. Seirim is literally translated as goats, but here he translates it as demons. They should not give the blood to the demons. Okay? What is this all about? So we are told, Asher hem zonim acharem, that the people in that generation, they were tempted, they strayed by following the demons. Okay, so number one, the people should no longer have access to blood. Blood was the tempting element of that generation, so there was a need to monitor, to control the blood flow within the nation. And then we are told in verse number 9 that you should know, or verse 10, drinking blood, karet. Next page. If a person slaughters an animal, on page 648, if you slaughter an animal that in general is not brought for a blood service in the temple, for example, a non-domesticated animal like a deer or a bird, those animals, when you slaughter them, you have to be sure there is a mitzvah called kisui hadam, to cover the blood, in Shile. We used to go to the slaughtering of chickens, right? They say that in Empire Chicken, I think they slaughter 180,000 chickens a day. Now this was like 15 years ago, 180,000 chickens a day. In Chile, we used to slaughter every 2 weeks 180 chickens. That was what the community needed at the time. It has grown, but at the time that was enough. About 360 chickens were enough for the Jewish community. So we would go to the shechita, and the entertainment was, there was far more entertainment by the shechita of the animals, of the bulls, because they had a primitive system of 4 individuals holding them down. And one time, thank God we weren't there, usually 4 would overcome 1, and one time the 1 was able to overcome the 4, and the bull ran out into the street and knocked into a car. And it was a scene that was not as bad as Baltimore, but it was a messy scene. So the shechita of the chickens, after the shechita, the shochet would make a bracha, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, al kisui hadam be'afar. There was an additional mitzvah to cover the blood. What's the idea behind it? So it finds its source here, and again, it relates to this concept that blood was very tempting, and therefore it must be covered. Next, in next week's parsha, meaning in the following parsha, in Kedoshim, we are told that people are warned, al tochlu al hadam, do not eat on the blood. Literally, it means that they would collect blood in some kind of pit. They would sit down and have a meal there. So the Torah tells us, al tochlu al hadam, it's a practice that is prohibited. To have a meal around the blood pit, that's against the values of Torah. Now, what's this all about? That's what we're going to try to clarify. Okay? Now, when we study Jewish practices, there are many, many levels of Jewish practices. There are those that we find their sources 200 years ago. There are those that we find their sources 500 years ago. There are those we find their sources in the Talmud and in the Mishnah, and then, of course, there are the ones in Torah. It is important to always understand the environment and the history that brought those minhagim to life. Right? And if you want to understand something that's significant for a community, you have to understand the history behind it. For example, a chuppah in a shul. We've been to weddings, and the weddings were inside the sanctuary. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has participated in such an event. There are those who are extremely against it, especially the Hungarians, right? That for them this is a very problematic practice, and therefore, for example, in the Beit, there are times, I don't know the meaning now, like during the summer, right? When it's nice outside, meaning like 6 weeks a year, they have a place outside where they have their weddings. Then there are many people that have their weddings inside the sanctuary, and then they have those hallway weddings, which are gaining popularity. If I'm not mistaken, it would be interesting to do a study one day, a PhD on research on the topic. Why are there those who pick the hallway over the sanctuary?
They have a skylight.
Okay, so the skylight could be the skylight, which is interesting that...
There's a skylight in the main show.
So there's a skylight there too, so it's not the skylight.
No.
The skylight is a very interesting one because, the Talmud tells us that if a person gets married in the first half of the month, it's a sign. There are all kind of omens. It seems to be that the omen of under the sky became the go-to omen. It's just basically a nice blessing. It's not something that is from Sinai. A nice thing to do.
The Yehudim have their weddings in churches.
Okay, so you mentioned the fact, and that is correct, that there was a practice among some in the cultures that existed in Europe that weddings were to be performed in a sanctuary among the Catholics, perhaps. And therefore, maybe we'll close the door. Thank you. So there was, for them, it was considered a mitzvah. And then, as in the beginning of the 19th century, as Reformed Judaism began its journey, they also considered it as a ideal or a requirement. So therefore, those who were trying to protect the old, namely followers of the Khatam Sofer, was considered the warrior against progressive change. So he declared that there is a prohibition of having a wedding in a sanctuary. Okay? Ramosha Feinstein was asked about it, and Ramosha Feinstein says, listen, it's a decree that relates to that period, to that time. In North America, right, it is not considered, we're not dealing with Catholics here, it's a Protestant country, and therefore for us there is absolutely nothing wrong to do it within a sanctuary. That's a custom. Now, again, you have to understand why such a practice came into existence, the environment, and therefore the history clarifies the practice. Another example. I speak in English in shul. I speak in shul upstairs in English. Right? Here and there I'll throw in a word in Hebrew or Yiddish, not more, Spanish. Now, the Chassam Sofer believes that there's a prohibition of speaking in the vernacular, that it is a chiyuv, it's an obligation. So harav zu reden in Yiddish. Now, I have a tremendous amount of reverence to the great Chassam Sofer. Do I have an obligation to follow it? So what I have to do is I have to understand the environment he is addressing. He was addressing a world where changing into the language spoken by the Gentiles indicated a breach in tradition. So he had to deal with the breach and he chose his path. Obviously, in the 21st century, times have changed. Okay, so you have to understand the times. Now,
but isn't that a slippery slope?
So you are concerned about the slippery slope.
Like sitting around the pit of blood or something and eating or drinking blood.
And we're slipping into the slope. Anyway, so the truth is, we have to understand the concept of communal structure. Judaism is based on communal structure. There is nothing worse, by the way, than coming into a community and not following their practices. The Talmud was extremely against it. If I have a stringency, and I come to a community that does not have that stringency, the worst thing to do is very divisive, and it's against the values of Torah, for me to practice my Judaism in a different way than everyone else. It could relate to a stringency I walk in with, or a leniency. For example, in the days of the Talmud, times have changed as we'll see soon. In the days of the Talmud, I show up in a shul, and everyone in that shul sits during the reading of the Torah, the Kriyat Torah. I decide, right, that I have a practice of standing. So while everyone else is sitting, I am standing. That is considered, number one, a disrespect. And number two, it harms the structure of Judaism. And structure is what keeps us alive. When you ask the question of slippery slope only exists if you are starting to break away the structure, right? The world I was born into, in other words, I was born into a world where the language, we speak in the vernacular, we speak in English. I am not breaking any structure. I would be breaking a structure, by the way, if I would start getting up on Shabbos and start giving my drush in Yiddish, right? So 3 people would understand it. That would be breaking structure. So you always have to assess the structure. In other words, Judaism is based not just on books or not on books, but on a communal structure. Now, a lot of structure collapsed, unfortunately, over the past 170 years. In other words, what happened was as follows. You had communities in Germany who actually developed Jewish communities with an agenda of uprooting Jewish traditions. There's no question about that. That Reform Judaism, their conferences in 1844, 1845, had in such an agenda. Fine. As a result, if I would show up in a community, right, that believes that there's no value in bris milah, no value to Shabbos, correct? Intermarriage is not really a problem. Obviously, I am not obligated to adjust myself to that community, because my obligation is to adjust myself to a community that values tradition. A community that does not value traditions, if I land up for a Shabbos in a town that the only synagogue is a Reformed temple, I do not have that halachic obligation of adjusting myself. I think we agree with that. But as a result, the problem was that people, right, come from Europe, they arrive in communities, they see a practice that they're not familiar with, so what do? They immediately label it as reform. So into the 20th century, a new approach exists, where you could go ahead and retain an old custom, ignore a communal custom, and still believe that you are doing the right thing. Meaning, there was a shift. So prior to the 19th century, you had absolutely no right to go against the minhag hamakom, right? If prior to the 19th century you show up in a shul and they do the chol hamoed, the men do wear tefillin, and you decide not to, extremely problematic, right? You are disrespecting and you are creating a breach in the structure that is keeping us together. All that became extremely problematic in the 20th century, and therefore we're a big mess. Okay, so that's addressing your slippery slope. But the idea is understand the era, then you will go ahead and understand the customs that develop. In other words, we've been discussing the Omer count, right? And the fact that there are several customs of mourning that we adopted during this period of time. Now, we wondered exactly the history behind it, because it works as follows. The earliest sources indicate that from Pesach to Shavuot, no marriages are to be performed. Fine. Then there is an early source that indicates that, listen, Shavuot is a Chag. The Chag itself is a time to be happy. Obviously, the impact of the Chag begins earlier, so 2 weeks prior to the Chag, this mourning comes to an end. Right? So therefore we're told that we mourn from Pesach to Shavuot until a half a month before Shavuot. Fine. But then suddenly you start visiting communities in Europe, and you realize that they have this practice that they actually begin their Omer count, or the period of mourning, not the counting, the Sfirat HaOmer, but the mourning starts on Rosh Chodesh Iyar and continues till Shavuot. And you ask yourself, where did that come from? Right? That's like a mystery. Where did that come from? A wedding, many people here have been at weddings. The last, from Pesach to Rosh Chodesh, they have weddings. Where did that come from? And then, in the 12th century, new custom of mournings developed, meaning the concept of not getting a haircut. Has no mention at all. No mention at all, when Rabbi Akiva's disciples died in the 2nd century, all the way for 1,000 years, right? For 900 years they're not mentioned. And suddenly, in the 12th century, they start talking about new customs of mourning. Where did that come from? So this is a mystery, so you have to study the era. And then you realize that the massacres that occurred in 1096, as Pope Urban, right, proclaimed the crusade to the land of Israel in November 1095. So in 1096, as they are making their way, traveling throughout Europe towards Jerusalem to liberate it from the Muslims, and eventually they did in 1099, as the Christians fought the Muslims and Jews who fought together. The Muslims and the Jews fought together against the primitive Christians. As they are making their journey, they massacre communities. And we have the exact dates when those communities were massacred in 1096. The 3rd of Iyar, another time during Iyar, the beginning of Sivan. So therefore, it is quite clear that many of the customs of mourning that were added due to the massacres of 1096. And also we understand as follows, that there was a tradition of keeping Omer 33 days. But the Jews felt that the 33 days that really had an impact on them, not the 2nd century disciples of Rabbi Akiva, but the tragedies of the 11th century all occurred from Rosh Chodesh Iyar until Shavuot. So that's when they adapted the custom of mourning during that period of time. Studying the history clarifies the custom. Fine? Now, you have to understand that the rabbis in every era are very mindful of what people consider significant. We know that during the last years of the Second Temple period, the masses, not the educated individuals, but the masses, considered the laws of purity and impurity as the most significant part of Judaism. And we have some absurd stories in the Talmud. Absurd stories. The Talmud's not absurd, but the stories they share about specific individuals tell you how ridiculous people thought, because the Talmud shares with us a story of 2 individuals who wanted to perform a service in the temple. They had a system of a race, that whoever gets to the top of the altar first is the one who merits to perform that service. So one guy was getting ahead of the other guy. So the fellow who was behind, who was really committed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and wants to perform the mitzvah of Avodas Beis HaMikdash, so he pulls out a pocket knife, and he stabbed the guy in front of him and killed him. Okay, this is what's presented in the Talmud. Now, if that sounds bad, when suddenly they realize there's an issue there, and someone declared, well, the guy is still alive. So they said, oh, good. So let's try to get him out of here, not to cause tumat met on the knife. And meaning there was more of a desire to protect the purity of an object than a human life. Now you tell me, is there something wrong? Yeah, there was something very wrong with the people at that time. And Judaism was fighting, right? Those who were knowledgeable were trying to fight such a way of thinking. And therefore what they did was, recognizing that the laws of Tumah and Tahara were so significant for them, they used them to protect other areas of Judaism that were ignored. For example, the Torah tells us that when you eat specific type of meats, you should not eat it after its designated period of time. It's called notar. When it's left over, no longer consume it. Now people ignored it. You see a piece of meat. So what, it was offered 3 days ago. I'm hungry now, I want to eat it. So how did the rabbis prevent people from touching it? They declared that if it is leftover, it causes tumah. Oh, they used the word tumah. That worked, right? So they understood, the rabbis understand the era, what language to use to prevent people from doing things. They had an issue that they used to have their shelves at home that was known as the holy shelf, meaning objects of sanctity. So what would they put there? So let's say they would have some grain and they would tithe it. And they had a portion designated for the Kohen. But the Kohen's not in town for the next few days. So they would put it on their shelf of holy objects. Next to that grain waiting for the Kohen was a scroll, Megillat Esther, Megillat Shir HaShirim. What would happen was that sometimes the Kohen would not come for a few days, and the mice would arrive before the Kohen. And the mice would eat the truma, which is not a good thing. But what's worse is that after eating truma, the mice for dessert would have some kohelas or shir hashirim or Esther, right? Depends on their taste, depends on what interests them. So the rabbis were realizing that scrolls were being consumed by mice, and they noticed that the problem was that they were keeping it next to food. So what did the rabbis decree? That you should know that those scrolls, metamet hayadayim, kas tumah. Oh, that worked. The rabbis were in touch. You have to know the era, and you have to make decrees based on that era. So that's an understanding of history. We talked about the Mishin Matzah. And the major controversy that erupted in 1857 through 1859, specifically in Lemberg and Lvov. And it is quite clear that many of the rabbis who were uncomfortable with it was because the equipment came from Germany. If it comes from Germany, right? If it comes from the West, it got to be treif, right? It's modern, it got to be treif. That was the approach that they had. So this is a very important part of Judaism, understanding the era. Now, then comes another question. If times have changed, does the decree change? That is a very significant question. And there's a well-known statement in the Talmud that on Shabbos, there is a prohibition to clap, and there's a prohibition to dance. You know, that's mentioned actually in the Talmud. No clapping and no dancing on Shabbos. Why did the rabbis prohibit such a thing? So the rabbis note that clapping and dancing lead to the usage of musical instruments. Now, what's so bad of a musical instrument on the Shabbat? So the rabbis tell us that a person playing his violin, and I might be corrected very soon here, a string might snap, and you might fix it. And fixing it is a Torah prohibition of tikkun mana, of fixing an object. So therefore the rabbis made a decree. Fine, so this appears in the Talmud. Come the Balei Atosvos in the 12th century, in the 13th century, and they noticed that there are many good Jews who actually clap on Shabbos. And there are many good Jews, even before the Hasidim, who were dancing on Shabbos. And the Balei Atosvos have a respect for the custom because, again, it's a Judaism that is not just based on a book, it's based on the practice of holy good Jews. So the Balei Atosvos struggle with the issue. The Talmud seems to indicate it's a problem. We see the people doing it. So the Tosfos tells us that you should know that times have changed. And this rabbinic decree of fixing musical instruments, we don't see people here in Paris or in northern France that are clapping and the next thing you know is they start fixing violins or pianos. We don't see that. So therefore the rabbinic decree of them is no longer significant. Now this raises a whole slew of questions. Well, if so, according to this statement, is it permissible today to play a musical instrument on Shabbat? That's a valid question that's been dealt with, right? And another area, so these are complex issues that have to be addressed. Another area, a practical area to understand an era. You know that there's a statement in Shulchan Aruch that on Shabbat, if you have what the rabbis call a michush be'alma, a discomfort, if you only have a discomfort, you are not to take medicine. This actually appears in Shulchan Aruch. Why would the rabbis, who are interested in us having Oneg Shabbat, limit our medicine intake? So we are told that if we would visit a community 1800 years ago and would ask them what a medicine is, so they would tell you we have these leaves, and we have a mortar, and we have a pestle. If someone has a little bit of a headache, naturally they're going to go ahead and grab it, take those herbs, crush them. You crush them, you violate a Torah prohibition of tochen. So the rabbis made a decree. So now comes the question, welcome to the 20th and 21st century. Does the decree still apply? Meaning, the rabbis make a decree. The environment has changed. Is the decree still relevant? It is well known that the Vilna Gaon, to keep the structure as is, declared that when the rabbis prohibit something, even if they present a reason, there are other reasons. Now, why does he make such a statement? Because then, even if there are changes, we don't feel comfortable in making an adjustment because perhaps there are other reasons that have not changed. That aside, if you want halachically, I know this is something that is relevant la halacha, you have to understand that since it's in the books, this decree, it's correct halacha, but whenever there is any leniency possible, it's permissible. I'll give you an example. A person suffers from allergies, right? Believe me, especially not here in Toronto, but if you go to places like Memphis, or they say, Baltimore actually is a place that there are a lot of allergies. In such a place, it's not a michu, it's not a discomfort, right? When you need medicine to deal with allergies, you can't label it discomfort. It's something that impacts the whole body. So obviously, any pain that impacts the whole body, the rabbinic decree doesn't apply. And there's a way of finding, I'm on tape now, but there's a way of finding a leniency almost in every single case due to the fact that the environment has changed. It's interesting that there's actually a tshuva that Rabbi Miller sent to Rav Moshe Feinstein of a person, wants to take an aspirin for a light discomfort on Shabbos. So he came up with an idea of mixing a little bit of the aspirin, and I don't know what a pharmacist would tell me, what Murray Shor would say, into applesauce, and eat the applesauce on Shabbos, right? So he writes it to Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe didn't buy the leniency, but Rabbi Miller himself still believes in it. In other words, he believes that that's another option. So creativity is one of the ways around, but the concept, what we're focusing on is understand the era. After you understand the era, you can understand the decree. And the list is very, very long. Now comes what the Rambam does. And what the Rambam, in the Guide of the Perplexed, he does something very unique. He takes this way of thinking that we're very comfortable to do it to understand the 18th century and even the 2nd century, but he subtly does this with Torah itself. He says, you want to understand why there's this paranoia, or why HaKadosh Baruch Hu is so concerned that we're going to go ahead and sit around a blood pit, or that we have to cover the blood, or that in the wilderness they were just told they must bring every single offering to the Ohel Moed. You want to know why? Because in those days, everyone believed that if you want to communicate with demons, the best way to do it is through blood. Now, the Rambam gets this information not by being creative when he reads Chumash, but he finds an old pagan book called The Agriculture of the Nabateans. And after reading the book, the Rambam tells us that any book written on history or on wisdom that was translated to Arabic, he read. He was a well-read individual. And the language of the wise men at that time, I mean, the enlightened people were the Arabs in the 12th century, the Muslims, right? They were the enlightened ones. When the Rambam wants to talk about primitive people, right? When he talks about the problem of pigs, raising pigs, how disgusting the environment becomes. So he writes that it will become disgusting like in France. Meaning Western Europe was considered primitive at that time. Barbarians, that's who were roaming the European continent. So now the Rambam finds the book, studies the book, and then he writes that suddenly almost every single mitzvah becomes clear. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is trying to fight idolatry. Idolatry is destructive because people offer their children as sacrifices. There's no values in society, and Hashem wants to change that. So you change it by uprooting practices. One of the most popular practices at that time was a belief that through blood you communicate with demons by either drinking blood, or even better, if you believe in the significance and how much you could achieve with a good 8-ounce glass of blood, but you are disgusted. So there's an option. What they would do in those days was that they would make a pit, pour blood into the pit, sit around the pit and have a meal, and then the demons who are attracted to the blood become buddies with them. And if they have a good nap afterwards, in their dreams, the demons are going to inform the people of the future. So if you wanted, and again, this was a desire that existed at that time. Today we follow sport teams. In those days they followed demons, meaning they wanted to know what the demons were thinking because the demons knew the future, the shadim. So the Rambam tells us that the Torah warns us, you have blood, bring it to in the wilderness. An area, by the way, that according to the way of thinking of that era, that is where you find the most educated demons who are going to give you the most information possible. So in the wilderness, this is a nation needs to be told, guys, we have a problem with your behavior. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you know what you have to do? I can't have you guys collect any blood in the wilderness. All sacrifices are to be offered in the Ohel Moed. And give the blood, hand your blood in to the Kohanim, and they're going to go ahead and pour it on the altar. If it's an animal that is not brought to the altar, like a non-domesticated animal like a deer or a bird, those, you go ahead and you cover the blood. And lo tochlu al adam, I am warning you, do not have these gatherings around the blood, because that was popular at that time. We must fight that. Torah is fighting such behavior. Now, so the Rambam gives us clarity as to why these mitzvot were practiced. However, what is very different than things we identify in the future history of our nation is as follows. That, for example, a parent says to a child, right? In the olden days when kids used to listen, a parent says to a child, please pick up something from the floor. Correct? And the child says, no, I don't want to do it. So there's a chutzpah there, right? Serious chutzpah there. So the child is punished, sent to his room. Now, what are you punishing the child for? Is it for the fact that the paper is still on the floor? Obviously not. What he is being punished for is for the fact that he is ignoring the parent. And even if it's a very minor, insignificant violation, ignoring the parent is what destroys the structure of a household. And basically what the Rambam is telling us is that once these mitzvot are in the Torah, even if times change, when there's no longer, no one, at least that I know, is attracted to blood due to the great communication you could have with demons, right? No one has such desires today. Nevertheless, the prohibition remains because it is already part of Torah. And if during the period of revelation, when God communicates with Moshe, he tells us this is something that should not be done, it remains for eternity. So this is a very different approach than a custom of 200 years ago. A custom of 200 years ago of, for example, not performing a wedding in a sanctuary, that is one that is not the word of God. It was stated due to the requirements of the time. Times change, obviously, where you are not affecting the structure of a community, they are no longer significant. That which is in Talmudic times is far more complex, correct? Because we know of many rabbinic decrees that even if the reason is no longer applicable, we still practice them. When it comes to the Torah, Torah says it is a reality that must be made. So that's a little bit of the Rambam's approach to the blood itself, but hopefully we gained a little bit of an insight into the general concept of time, structure, and the approach to minagim. Yes?
So what about the dictum, ki adam hu nefesh?
Oh, it's interesting that, very good question. Nachmanides, Ramban, does not buy this explanation of the Rambam. And he tells us that if you look in the text, we are told, ki adam hu banefesh, right? So the text seems to indicate that the issue with blood is nothing to do with trying to utilize it for spiritual purpose, but simply the soul is within the blood. So it could be that what we are being, the way the Rambam would read it, was that they believed that they could connect to souls through the blood. Okay, so it's not that there is the simple reading that it is the soul in the blood, but it's the specific soul, the seirim, that they want to connect to. But your question is Nachmanides' question. So the answer is difficult because we have to defend Rambam against Nachmanides, but nevertheless, it's perhaps a way of dealing with what the Rambam viewed as pshat.
I heard there was one opinion, when you were talking about clapping and dancing on Shabbos, there was one opinion that we don't follow the not dancing part because what the men do around that thing is not really considered.
The yeshiva shuffle.
Why is the emphasis both that it's whether you slaughter outside the camp or inside the camp? Is it just for greater emphasis, or there's another reason that it strikes that way?
You can assume that it's a greater emphasis.